Disability discrimination. Law is, I'll tell you what, laws come and go. And what happens with laws is they're kind of like pendulums, all right? And somebody introduces a law, and then that law gets taken advantage of to the point that people almost abuse it. As a result, courts come into play, and they say, we're going to take away these rights, or we're going to narrow the rights. And then they get so narrow that it swings the other way. And that's the nature of laws. And that's really very clearly what has happened with the Americans with Disabilities Act, okay? And that's the federal law that we're going to talk about. Again, disability is generally a component of most state law claims, Missouri Commission on Human Rights Act, okay? But we're going to focus most of our time on the Americans with Disabilities Act. And when that act first came out, it got to the point that everybody was saying anything was a disability. I mean, literally, if you had a hangnail, it was going to be a claim of a disability. The problem is, then courts came in and said, hey, nothing's a disability. And I mean, to give you an example, epilepsy was not a disability where you had rights under the Americans with Disabilities Act, because if you took medication for it, then you could control it, and therefore it wasn't a disability. Now, as a result of some of those laws, what has happened is it swung the other way, and there has been, in 2009, I think, they entered into the Americans with Disabilities Amendments Act, which puts in certain amendments, took care of or replaced certain court decisions, including those which said epilepsy is not a disability because it can be controlled or whatever. And so it's come back. The last time I went to a seminar on this, when I was in private practice, which 7 months ago, I guess, was that, hey, people are taking the position that anything is a disability right now. And the question is, did you do everything you could do to accommodate it? Don't try to be arguing that it's not a disability, because the courts under the new act are supposed to find that there is, in fact, a disability. So that's kind of the where we get to. That law is still changing. I think you'll see courts narrow it down a little bit more till we get a happy medium. Like religion, it requires a reasonable accommodation. Now remember, the American with Disabilities Act is a completely separate law than Title VII. The accommodation under the religion discrimination is because of Title VII. No other section of Title VII requires the accommodation for discrimination. Under the Americans with Disabilities Act, you have to have accommodation if you can, okay? So it requires reasonable accommodation. To begin with, what is a disability? Let me give you the definition, okay? A disability, or an individual with a disability, is a person who, one, has a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities. It is a person with a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more of life's major activities. 2, it is a person who has a record of such an impairment. And by the way, these are alternative. These are not and, okay? And the disjunctive, alternative. Physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities, or a person who has a record of such impairment, or 3, a person who is regarded as having an impairment, such an impairment, okay? So, person who has physical or mental impairment, substantially limiting one or more major life activities, a record of such impairment, or 3, regarded as having such an impairment. Okay. Now, let's take those one at a time. With regard to the first one, person that has a physical or mental impairment substantially limiting one of life's major functions. What is that? Give me an example of that.
Being in a wheelchair.
All right, being in a wheelchair, okay? Because when we talk about life's activities, give me some examples. What are some of life's major activities? Walking. Huh? Seeing. Sleeping. Hearing. Breathing. Yeah, that's a major life activity, okay? Standing, reaching, okay? Lifting, bending, reading, concentrating, thinking, walking, okay? Those are all major life activities. So if you've got somebody who has cerebral palsy or is in a wheelchair for some reason, that's easy. The definition number one is easy. Now, what about the second part? It's a person who has a record of such an impairment. Give me an example of that. They may overlap, by the way, but they may not. Patrick.
Would that be like doctor, you'd have to show by physically disabled and in a wheelchair and not able to move or something like that?
Yeah, I mean that, let's take that, okay? But let's say that I had that, but now I'm able to walk, okay? Now, if you have that, there's a record of that impairment. So not only do I meet the first definition under your example, but I also meet the second because I got a record of it. But let's take your example and let's say I had a surgery that came along, technology changed, and now I can walk, okay? And there's nothing wrong with me. But you as my employer are looking through and you say, wait a second, Groves has been in a wheelchair for 6 years. There's no way he's going to be able to do this job. At that time, I have a disability under this act, okay? And you can't discriminate against me, even though I can run, okay? Does that make sense? Generally, where you see this record of impairment is where you have a situation of a person, or frequently where you see it, it's a person who's an alcoholic, okay? Because while you can be fired, an employer can fire you because you're drinking on the job or because you're not coming to work, okay? If you think you're going to get fired and you haven't, the smartest thing you can do as an employee is go to your employer and say, hey, I need rehabilitation. Because now I'm an alcoholic and I need rehabilitation. Because now once you've said that, okay, and they haven't fired you yet, now you're letting them know that you have a disability. And alcoholism can be a disability, okay? Now, so what we generally see as far as record of having a record of such an impairment is where somebody has successfully rehabbed, coming back to work, but so-and-so says, hey, you can't hire them. I was on CaseNet and I saw where they had a DWI, and I think they were ordered to go to treatment for alcoholism, okay? And that would be a record of such an impairment. That person would be deemed to have a disability even though they may not have any problems with alcohol anymore, okay? Third one is where they are regarded as having such an impairment. Where they are regarded as having such an impairment. Had a case, actually, when I first took it, thought it was the best case I'd ever had as far as disability goes. And then as we got into it, it had some trucking regulations that interfered. But I had a guy who went to a doctor and was diagnosed with bipolar. And no past records that we could find showed bipolar. He had lost his kids through a custody battle. He was having a tough time with it. He was depressed. He went to his employer, said, hey, I got to take some time off. I'm not doing really well. They said, come back when you're better. He comes back. They say, we want the doctor's note. They got the doctor's note, and it said he has bipolar. and they wouldn't let him come back to work anymore. And we actually wrote all the letters for him and said, hey, I'm ready to come back to work. I don't have bipolar, but tell me why you fired me. And they wrote back and said, we fired you because you have a record that says you have bipolar. So it's like, well, wow, we've got a disability claim here. And we really did. We tried to work with him. Turns out there were some trucking regulations that, and clearly, you don't want somebody who driving an 18-wheeler who has serious issues or is on serious medication, okay? And then those, we had to work around those with regard to that case. But that would be a perfect example of somebody who was regarded as having an impairment. While he had the record of it, even though he didn't have it, they came right out and said, we think you have bipolar and therefore we're not going to hire you back. So whether he had it or not didn't matter. It's whether you're regarded as it. So if somebody just believes it or treats you as having a disability, that can make you a disabled person under the law, whether you're perfectly fine to do whatever. Amanda.
What if an employee has a disability but the employer doesn't know?
Okay.
I mean,
If
does
the
the employee have to tell the employer? Or if someone's fired because they're not showing up to work but really they have a mental condition that they weren't able to?
Yeah, the employee is generally, there may be some exceptions. The employee is generally not required to tell the employer they have a disability, okay? And you may remember, weeks ago when we talked about some construction and crime law and the Alcohol Act, that if you had been convicted of a crime that you may have to report that to a federal contractor. But generally an employee doesn't have to tell an employer they have a disability. Now, if the employer doesn't know, as a human resource manager, you terminate somebody and you don't even know, it's going to be hard to prove that you discriminate against them on the basis of a disability, okay? Because if they're just not showing up, as an employer, you don't have a duty to go out and say, why aren't you showing up, okay? Does that kind of answer your question? Yeah. If they don't know, they don't know, okay? Other questions about that? Now, keep in mind, in order for this act to protect you, you actually have to be qualified. So not only do you have to have a disability, but you have to be qualified to do the job. And when we talk about qualified, you have to satisfy the requisite skills, education, experience, other job-related requirements of the position. So for instance, am I discriminating against somebody on the basis of a disability who is a quadriplegic and I refuse to hire them for the position of a fireman? Well, yes, I'm discriminating against them because they have a disability. But to the question that you're answering is that illegal discrimination? Tom, no. Why?
Because in order to be a firefighter, you have to climb stairs, you have to be able to use an axe, you have to be able to climb a ladder.
Yeah.
And a quadriplegic, you can't do anything.
They're not qualified, okay? They're not qualified. Do they have a disability? Yes. Am I discriminating against them on the basis of that disability? Yeah, but not illegally because they're not qualified, okay? I'm not hiring them because of their disability, no doubt about it. That's the reason I choose not to hire them. But that's okay because they can't perform the essential functions of the job, okay? And that's the other requirement of being qualified. Not only do you have to have the requisite job skills, but you have to be able to perform, and that's the magical language, perform the essential functions of the job, okay? Perform the essential functions of the job with or without accommodation, okay? You have to be able to perform the essential functions of the job with or without accommodation. Now, is there an accommodation where we can take a quadriplegic and provide them accommodation that would enable them to perform the essential functions of a fireman? Probably not. Probably not. All right? So that we can understand kind of this context, give me an example of a disability where, with a reasonable accommodation, somebody could perform the essential functions of the job.
A secretary, like if you're quadriplegic.
Okay. All right. Secretary who's a quadriplegic may be able to perform the essential functions of the job with what? What accommodations might we make for him or her?
Speak to type program.
Okay. Speak to type program. Okay. What else? Might have to accommodate by moving furniture around. I mean, accommodation can take place in a lot of ways. Okay. Can be making a larger workspace. Okay. It can be any number of things. Okay. Giving them a different type of chair. People with back injuries frequently need a different type of chair to sit in. And so you can accommodate that person with a back injury by providing them an accommodation. Okay? You do not have to accommodate the person who is regarded as having a disability. Why?
Because they may or may not actually have a disability.
Because they don't have the disability. Yeah, if they're merely regarded as, I mean, if they're only regarded, if they don't have the disability, you don't have to accommodate them because they don't have anything to accommodate. But the question becomes, can they perform the essential functions of the job with or without a reasonable accommodation? Now, here's where we keep it separate from the religious accommodation. What was our standard for religious accommodation, whether we had to accommodate them or not?
Causes an undue hardship.
Yes, causes an undue hardship. Same standard here, okay? Where there is an undue hardship, you don't have to accommodate. What was our definition for undue hardship with regard to religious discrimination?
More than de minimis.
More than de minimis, okay? For disability, however, it's much higher than that. It's a much higher standard than that, okay? And it's much harder to prove. For religious, you just had to barely show that it was more than de minimis, okay? For an employer, you're going to have to show a lot, okay? So, for instance, it may cost me more money under a disability. Let's go back to our Dairy Queen example. We got somebody who has a disability, and because of their disability, they're not able to make it in Friday morning at 8 o'clock, okay, for whatever reason. But the nature of their disability, they can't make it in Friday morning at 8 o'clock, all right? But they can make it in at 9. For the religious accommodation, I don't have to hire somebody else at 8 o'clock. I can require that person to come in regardless. For the disability situation, I've now got to hire that person because it's only going to cost me an hour. I got to hire somebody else to come in, okay? So again, much harder with regard to disability. You better be ready to spend some funds and to spend the money to go make the accommodations. Okay, much harder. With regard to the ADA, a couple of things so that if as human resource people or management people, you are prohibited from asking about a disability, the existence, nature, or severity of disability. Okay? You can't just say, hey, tell me about your disabilities. Okay? You may ask about the ability to perform the functions of a job. That's why job descriptions are important. And so when you get into management resources or human resources, you want job descriptions for your jobs so that you can outline all of the things that the jobs can do, or that the job that is needed for the job. Because then in the interview process, you can ask the person, can you do this? Can you do this? Can you do this? Can you do this? Okay? You can't ask them if they got a disability, but you can ask them if they can perform what the functions and requirements of the job are. And then you're not required or permitted, let's do it that way, you're not permitted to require pre-employment medical examinations of applicants. Okay? But once you extend a job to them, you can then ask them to take a medical exam, so long as you do it of all employees. All right? So I'll give you an example. Let's say Kyle comes to me for an interview. I can not say to Kyle, look, I'd love to interview you, Kyle, but before we meet next week, I want you to go over here to Dr. Benson's office or whoever and do a medical examination. I can't do that. What I can do is say, Kyle, come on in, let's talk. And after interviewing Kyle, say, you know what? I think you're going to be a great fit for the job. But before I hire you, and I want to hire you, and here's the job, I'm ready to offer it to you, I just need you to meet this medical examination, okay? Now, I can do that with Kyle so long as I do it with everybody else, or at least everybody else for that particular job function, or who works in that position, okay? Now, questions with regard to, I mean, that's the nuts and bolts of it. Again, defenses are going to be the same, showing a reason other than disability, having a bona fide occupational qualification where, you know, and that goes really without saying. Either they can or cannot perform the job. Amanda, question?
What if it's a temporary impairment?
Pardon?
If it's a temporary impairment, physical impairment?
Yeah, if it's a temporary impairment, you may not have to accommodate it. When we talk about the swing of the pendulum, we're watching the court cases on that. But for the most part, temporary impairments are not going to qualify as disabilities. Okay? Now, let's put that in perspective. If I have chronic back pain, but it doesn't happen every day, but it's on an ongoing basis, that's not going to be temporary, even though it doesn't happen all the time. You with me? Okay? On the other hand, let's take when I had cataract surgery. You know, probably could have gone back to work the same day, but they said you're going to be out. Or let's go back to my retina detachment. I was laying flat for 4 weeks. I had to lay flat for 4 weeks, okay? Would not have qualified as a disability per se, because after 4 weeks I was going to be able to do everything. Now, as it turned out, had an eye that I was going to be blind with. So the blindness probably would have been a disability. The short-term part of that would not have been. Does that make sense? Generally don't have to accommodate for a temporary disability. On the other hand, good employment practice is you don't want to terminate somebody just because of that, unless you have to, okay? And there may have been some questions, don't know, with regard to disability. Did that answer, as to what you have to do? I know I had 1 or 2 questions I saw right before I was coming over here on disability. Okay. All right. Any other questions? Okay. Gosh, you know everything about employment law and discrimination, right?
That's correct.
Yeah, there you go, Patrick. Thank you. Patrick's going, I want to get out of here. By the way, let's just cut to the chase, although it's now passed. I probably should have taught the religious accommodation early on. Cheering for the Cardinals and the Yankees, okay, is not a religion, right? It is not a religion. So let's be clear of that. All right.
Are you about